formal it is, but I could go on for days about Robert's accomplishments. I will say that having spent so far 23 years in the field of Holocaust education, I've learned that there are countless pieces that comprise this historic puzzle. Just when you think you've seen it all, heard it all, along comes a scholar like Robert Watson, who opens your eyes to yet another story and another perspective. It's my pleasure to tell you a little bit about his background, and believe it or not, this is a condensed version, very condensed. Robert received his undergraduate degree at Virginia Tech, where he was a member of the football and track teams. He earned
Long time ago.
I'm sure you can still set records, right? He earned his master's degree at the University of West Florida and a PhD in public policy at Florida Atlantic University. In 2007, he joined the faculty at Lynn University in Boca Raton, Florida, where he serves as Professor of American Studies and Senior Fellow at the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, if their website is still up to date. His goal is to instill in his students the joy of learning and a hunger for discovery, so they will become lifelong learners, better citizens, neighbors, consumers, and family members. Quite a noble goal. In addition to publishing more than 40 books and hundreds of scholarly articles, more than 40 books, and hundreds of scholarly articles, book chapters, and essays, he's delivered over 1,500 lectures to civic and professional groups, libraries, historic sites, universities, and other audiences. He doesn't show his age very well. He accomplished all of that.
Let me give you my glasses so you can see that.
He has convened national conferences on the American presidency, co-founded the Truman Legacy Symposium that's held annually at the Little White House in Key West, Florida, and sponsored by the Truman Presidential Library. But that's only the tip of the iceberg, and I actually wrote that down with no Titanic pun intended. Then I went, here. Dr. Watson's been interviewed by media outlets, including CNN, MSNBC, Time, USA Today, the New York Times, BBC, and others, and has appeared on Hardball with Chris Matthews, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, CNN's Inside Politics with Judy Woodruff, and Fox's Special Report with Brit Hume. He has interviewed presidential candidates, noted jurists, prominent editors and journalists, public dignitaries, former White House aides, and presidential children and grandchildren, which must have been fascinating. He edits and directs the report to the First Lady, which is presented to the White House at the time of the inauguration of a new administration. You may have to change that title.
I know.
Robert has lectured on cruise ships and study tours, and has been selected as a visiting fellow or scholar in residence with many organizations, including the Truman Presidential Library, Gerald Ford Presidential Museum, the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and the United States Military Academy at West Point. He and his wife Claudia reside in Boca Raton with their children Alessandro and Isabella. He and Alessandro actually co-authored a novel together titled Tsunami. I think they have a water thing going on.
Yeah, I know.
Which won second place in the International Book Awards Juvenile Fiction category. Watson's active in his Boca Raton community, organizing voter registration drives, providing civic education programs for schools, offering workshops for educators, hosting community town halls, moderating political debates. He's co-founded 3 nonprofits dedicated to civic engagement, grassroots political reform, and fact-checking political ads.
Keeps us busy. Yeah, it keeps us busy.
For his work, Robert has won numerous awards, including International Abraham Lincoln Award for contributions to the study of the presidency, the Children's Hero Award for civic programs he offers to schools, League of Women Voters Award, for their Good Government Award for efforts to enhance voter education and participation, Lynn University's Outstanding Professor of the Year, and Florida Atlantic University's Distinguished Professor of the Year. The South Florida Business Journal named him Heavy Hitter in Education, and he's been inducted into 2 Sports Halls of Fame, which I assume are track and football.
Long time ago.
There was no date on it. What may be the most meaningful endorsements to Robert are those posted by some of the students at Lynn. One student wrote, "Incredibly interesting and informed, takes a personal interest in students, sent to Lynn from Central Casting as the perfect professor.
This is all new to me. I didn't see
Well, I
this.
also found out that you got at least one hot chili pepper from one of your students.
Oh,
For those of
really?
you who don't know what it means, look it up.
Uh-oh.
It's
Don't tell
pretty-
my wife.
I know, it's actually evaluating your professors based on their hotness. So, as we welcome Dr. Robert Watson to Kansas City, I will leave you with another quote from one of his students who says, "You are in the presence of greatness."
Oh, my. Thank you. Okay. All right, now that I'm completely embarrassed, is the mic on? Can you hear me okay? In the back? Okay, good. Thanks for the invitation to come here. I seem to get to KC every few years. Harry Truman's my favorite president, so I try to make my pilgrimage back here as often as possible. Neil Johnson, the Harry Truman impersonator's in our audience, so it's as good as it gets. Thanks, Harry. Yeah, Neil and I have known each other for a long time. The story I'm going to tell you tonight is a bizarre story. It's one I never intended to write, and it was a more difficult book to write than the other 40 put together. This was one of the most challenging things I've ever done in my life. We tend to have the view, incorrectly, that we know all there is to know about history. In fact, there's more we don't know than we do know. Daniel Boorstin, the late great Librarian of Congress, had this law of the unread that he talked about. And what he said was probably 99% of all the books ever written are gone. They've decomposed, been lost, burned, destroyed on purpose, which is a whole other topic. If that's the case, if we go back 200 years or 2,000 years, and historians try to make sense of something, we're working with less than 1% of the written record, which to my mind means we know less than 1% of what happened. Add to that the fact that history books don't tell you this, but paper or parchment and something to write on, throughout history, it was exceedingly expensive and prohibitively rare. So only maybe the elite 1% even had something to write with. Most people were illiterate. If there's more we don't know about history than we do know, we could safely say there's 99% we don't know about women's history, because most women were illiterate. If a woman did write something down, no man saw fit because of sexism to preserve it. If it was preserved, men don't see fit today to write about it or cherish it or hold it up. So there's more we don't know than we do know. Even about events as momentous as the Holocaust, the world's worst instance of genocide, or the Second World War, the most bloody conflict in world history. Think about it this way. The Shoah Foundation has done a remarkable job recording thousands of interviews with Holocaust survivors, but there are at least 6 million interviews they'll never conduct. World War II museums, from the one in New Orleans to my favorite, the Imperial War Museum in London, they have collected helmets and cannons and tanks, but there were 60 to 80 million people who died during the war. We don't have their stories. So if we take Boorstin's law of the unread, that 99% of all the books or written material that was ever produced is gone, the corollary that I write about and talk about all the time is this. Not only are we missing 99% of all the books, I believe we're probably missing 99.9% of all the things that made us distinctly human. The love letters, the poetry, the recipes, the musical scores, the games children played, things that breathe life into the human narrative. That's gone. So what do we really know? We know some details about a battle, and then we have to wait 50 years for the next war to get some more details about that. What happened in between? So we've lost the human side of history, and too many times historians and history books write as if they're attempting to take the humans out of the historical narrative. We got to put them back in. History's filled with love and loss, triumph and tragedy, that if we did it the right way, it would make people want to study it. So apropos to that, I was never going to write this book. I was working on a book. It was going to be on the last week of World War II. I wanted to start with Hitler killing himself on April 30th, cyanide pill, bullet to the head, and then burn in the garden, and end about a week later with VE Day in Europe. And what I wanted to do was, I wanted to try to tell that last week of the war in a very intimate and personalized way. Ironically and almost counterintuitively, the last week of World War II is one of the few aspects about the war that we really haven't studied. We don't know what happened at the end. It was absolute chaos. So what I thought would be an interesting book would be to take each one of the last days, from Hitler's suicide to VE Day, and find one example of love and one example of loss each day. Maybe someone got married. Maybe there was a baby born 2 days before the end of the war. Who was the last soldier killed? And that would make it a very powerful look at the last week of the war. While I was doing my research, I was hunting down instances of love and loss. And I came across, by dumb luck, a letter from a major in the British Army named Till, T-I-L-L. And Till says in the letter, basically, of all the horrors of World War II, the one nightmare that I will never forget, the worst thing imaginable, was when thousands and thousands and thousands of innocent Holocaust prisoners were killed by mistake in the final moments of the war. And I went, oh my gosh, what is this letter? And I had never heard of such a thing. So I called some leading World War II scholars and some leading Holocaust scholars, and I said, what is this event? And they all said, never heard of it. It didn't happen. Maybe the date's wrong, maybe it was a prank, maybe it's a misunderstanding, maybe it's a, right? So I put the letter aside and kept digging. Then I find a letter from a British general. His name was Mills Roberts, and he was the general in charge of the British 6th Commando, a special forces unit. And he was a very tough guy, kind of like a General Patton, only not the SOB that Patton was. So he's a very tough and capable general, a lifetime in uniform. And Mills Roberts says that he's seen everything, but the one thing that he will never be able to erase from his mind, he tells the same story. That's when I said there's something here. So I followed the paper trail, and it took me to the basement of the Royal Archives in London. What happened was this event really did happen in the final moments of the war, and the British government was so shocked and embarrassed by what happened that they sealed and classified all the documents until the year 2045, making it the 100-year secret. Have I piqued your interest? So what would you do? You would do, yeah, good. You would do, no, good. That's a future historian right there. So you and I would have done the same thing. I never wrote the other book. I pursued this book. The problem was I couldn't get full access to a lot of the documents. Think about it this way. At the end of World War II, there were millions and millions of documents locked away. I submit that most of them we still haven't even looked at. Archivists will tell you there's only so much time in a day, and it takes forever to verify, archive, digitize, and then catalog these documents. Do you remember the end of the Indiana Jones movie? When they got the Ark and they put it in a crate, and someone took it to the basement of NARA. Maybe it's here in Kansas City, I don't know. Remember they put it there, and it's probably still there, so who knows what's there. I am not a conspiracy theorist, I'm the opposite. But there's so much that's still there that we just simply, for lack of time, haven't had a chance to look at it. I would suggest that there are some documents probably regarding this story that the British archivists and government, they still don't even know they're down there. Somebody's going to trip across them one day, and there you go. I remember one visit to the Truman Library. A librarian named Liz Safley had found an old real estate book that had some heretofore unwritten notes from Harry, and I think she found it while just simply cleaning a shelf. So one of these days, someone's going to clean something, and we're going to find more secrets about World War II and the Holocaust. So I couldn't get access to it. But I'm lecturing in Normandy for an anniversary of D-Day. I'm there. It was wonderful. We're at Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, with some of these World War II veterans, and I'm supposed to lecture. I'm just quiet listening to them. But we're walking on the beach, and I meet a woman around my age. Her name was Deborah Oppenheimer, and she was the most fascinating person. She's an Academy Award winner. You may have seen her documentary on the Kindertransport called Into the Arms of Strangers. Dame Judi Dench, Sir Attenborough. She's part of the team of Downton Abbey, which is my wife and I's favorite show, right? She knows Spielberg. Obama appointed her to the board of the U.S. Holocaust Museum. So she's telling me about her movies, and I'm just enthralled. So I said, would you join my wife and family and I for dinner? She says, if my parents could come along. So her parents come in, and they walk in, and I go, Eric, Gloria, they go to all my lectures in South Florida. Now, I heard that everybody has to have a parent that retires to South Florida, but apparently it's true, right? So they say to Deborah, Robert's a good historian. We like his books. So she says, tell me about your books. So I said, well, that's boring, but I will tell you there's this one I want to write, but I can't get a hold of all the documents. So Deborah says, let me make a phone call. Remember, she knows everybody in London through her work with Downton Abbey. She's friends with Maggie Smith. Where are my Downton Abbey fans, right? She says Maggie Smith's very cool, by the way. There's your insider information for the night. So she makes a phone call. Get this, 2 days later, I check my email from France. I get an email from the director of the Imperial War Museum, the greatest war museum on earth. He says, we're going to release everything. What would you like? And I said, everything now. And he sent it to me by Dropbox, and now they're still digitizing. So here's the story. The Germans love their ships. In the 20th century, some of the finest vessels afloat were made by Germans. And Germans took a lot of pride in their shipbuilding, kind of like the American pride about cars in the 50s and 60s. We had that car culture. Germany loved its ships. And one of the ways in the 1920s to recover from World War I was the company Hamburg South America, or Hamburg Süd, S-U, glottal stop, D. Hamburg Süd wanted to make the greatest ocean liner afloat. They were going to redo the Titanic. They studied the Titanic and found what they thought were design flaws. They made a thicker hull, they put more lifeboats on it, and they made the Titanic. Launched in 1927. It was named the Cap Arcona, which is a name for Cape Arcone, which is a cape in the southern Baltic, north central Germany. She was launched in 1927. She looks like the Titanic, except 3 funnels instead of 4 smokestacks. Almost as big, similar in opulence. She had the 7-course dinners, the walking track, heated pools, tennis courts, full orchestra. The creme de la creme went on the boat. Clark Gable and lots of dashing American actors, European monarchs. In the 1920s and 30s, it was perhaps the most celebrated ship afloat. Now, all that would change in the 30s with the rise of the Nazis. Hitler comes to power in 1933, and what happens is here, lo and behold, Hitler loved big ships. It was a sign of power. He loved big ships. So this ship instantly catches the attention of Hitler, Goebbels, Göring, Himmler, all the top Nazis. And in the 1930s, they used this ship for propaganda purposes, basically saying to the world, your Titanic sunk, look at ours. Look at what we can do. We make the greatest ships afloat. So they used it for propaganda purposes. Now, in 1939, when the war starts, the ship is moved to the Polish coast, the Pomeranian coast. They basically let it sit and rust in present-day Gdynia, which the Germans had taken over and renamed Gottenhafen. There she sits rusting as a floating naval training platform. Now, fast forward to the year 1942. 100 fascinating things happen with the ship in between there, but you'll have to read the book. But in 1942, what happens is Hitler has a meeting with Joseph Goebbels, and they're both deeply concerned. The war is changing in its complexion, thank goodness. The North African theater collapses for the Nazis. The Eastern Front, when the Nazis charge in Operation Barbarossa into Russia, the brutal winter kills entire armies. Even the Western Front, Operation Sea Lion, Hitler and the Nazis want to invade the British Isles. Before the invasion, they of course famously send the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, to bomb Britain. A few British pilots, made famous by the Winston Churchill speech, the few, save England. So by 42, all these fronts are collapsing. Hitler and Goebbels have a meeting, and Hitler tasks Goebbels with the following. Goebbels was the propaganda minister. He tells Goebbels, you need to come up with something so epic and so diabolic. It's like a James Bond villain. So epic and so diabolic that it will change the complexion of the war and make the world hate the British and the Allies and love us, the Nazis. This is how delusional and desperate they were. Now, what is this epic diabolical thing they're going to do? They don't know. The one thing they did know was they loved movies. Hitler and Goebbels watched movie after movie after movie. Even though Hollywood films and British films were banned inside of Germany, they would have their agents steal them. And it was not uncommon for Hitler and Goebbels to watch 3 movies back to back to back, all night long with translators over their shoulder interpreting. And after the movies, they would sit for hours debating the cinematography and script. They considered themselves film connoisseurs. They were Germany's Siskel and Ebert, you might say. And they would debate and debate and debate film. I went through, it was a painful task, but I reread Goebbels' diaries in their English translation, all of Hitler's aides like Martin Bormann, to try to figure out what the heck they were watching. And as best as I could tell, the three movies that they seemed to like the most, one was Gone with the Wind. They loved Gone with the Wind. Two was King Kong, the old King Kong. Loved King Kong. And the movie that it seems to me that they watched the most, and you can't make this stuff up, everybody. You ready? Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I'm serious, I kid you not. Well, remember, it was a Germanic maiden in the Black Forest, right? So they watched Snow White all the time. At any rate, after watching these movies one time, Goebbels wrote that instead of their usual debate that they would always do, they were so emotionally drained from the movie that they both just sat there and watched the credits roll. Unfortunately, neither one said which was the movie. So we don't know what movie just left them emotionally exhausted. While they're watching the credits roll, something dawns on Hitler and Goebbels. The producers, the directors, the actors, the cinematographers, the script writers were all Jewish. Goebbels wrote that he kicked over every chair in the viewing studio. He freaks out. That's when Hitler and Goebbels have an idea. The epic diabolical thing that's going to change the war, a movie. They're going to make the greatest movie ever made, and it's going to be Cecil B. DeMille-esque. Cast of thousands, greatest story ever told. And it's going to be so powerful, it's going to change the complexion of the war. Only they're going to propagandize the movie. Now, the movie that Hitler and Goebbels hated the most was Casablanca, because it was an anti-Nazi propaganda film, but you didn't realize it because it was wrapped up into a good script, good acting, good cinematography, right, everyone? So they wanted to make something like a Casablanca and then propagandize it. Goebbels was mass-producing Nazi propaganda films, but they were so ridiculously juvenile, ham-fisted, and overtly propagandized. Jude Seuss, Der Vigor Jude, the Eternal Jew. They were two of the most famous. Every one of these had the same plot. There was an idyllic Bavarian village until the Jewish guy moved in. And when he comes in, he only appears at night and he looks like Dracula. And wherever he goes, literally, unless if you miss the message, rats scurry behind him. It gets dark when he appears. You have the foreshadowing, ominous music building like in the horror movies. And then the citizens rise up with pitchforks and drive the Jewish guy out of town and everybody lives happily ever after. So it's so pathetically ham-fisted. So Goebbels is tasked by Hitler with developing a Casablanca-esque greatest movie ever made. It's going to change the complexion of the war. The second thing he tasked Goebbels with doing is this. He was so furious with the success of the Hollywood movies, Jewish Hollywood, as they said, that he tasked Goebbels with opening up a new propaganda front in the war against Jewish Hollywood. Goebbels was supposed to use this epic movie to launch what they called Hollywood on the Rhine, to show the world that the Aryans do it better. So this is where they are. Now, what's the movie to change the war? They came up with the great movie. I would argue with you one of the most iconic things in human history is the Titanic, right? People have a morbid fascination. If we were to come back to Earth in 1,000 years, people will still talk about the Titanic, and there'll be another film. So they decided they would make their version of the Titanic. They would make the Nazi Titanic. And the star of the movie would be, of course, what? The Cap Arcona. They already had the Titanic. They had already had the greatest ship afloat. So Hitler and Goebbels are going to make the Nazi Titanic. It's going to change the war. They allocate an unlimited budget. It would be the most expensive movie ever made up until something like 1960. They reassigned entire military units, even though they were at war, to be the extras and the cast and all that. They reassigned their best engineers to make the sets. They clean up the Nazi Titanic and they refit her with all of her Persian rugs and silk this and chandeliers and gold, the grand stairwell, and they're going to make this movie. Now the problem for them, though, was they couldn't find a director. It seems that most of Germany's greatest directors were in the concentration camps. So they find a guy named Herbert Selpin, S-E-L-P-I-N, and they picked Selpin because he specialized in making sort of Indiana Jones-like movies. In fact, if you look at his movies, it looks like Indiana Jones. There was always a German professor archaeologist who goes to Africa, discovers a treasure, fights the locals, wins the girl. You know, good movie formula. So Selpin made these muscular action films. That's what they wanted. So they hire Selpin. They hire the best actors in Germany, the most beautiful models, and they're going to do this epic film. Thankfully for us, everything that could go wrong with the movie went wrong. The lead actress gets pregnant by one of the German soldiers. The soldiers get drunk on set and destroy the set. The Titanic sinks at night, so they don't want to do it in a studio. They want to get the real Titanic, this Nazi one, and they want to film the sinking at night. The problem, Germany's under a blackout because of Allied bombing. So Hitler and Goebbels give the director, Herbert Selpin, an exemption. He can film at night with those giant ballyhoo kind of lights. With the lights, what happens? The film set gets bombed by the Allies. Everything goes wrong. Hitler's increasingly desperate for his movie. Goebbels is increasingly desperate for Hollywood on the Rhine. They're leaning on the director who hates the Nazis. Herbert Selpin can't handle it anymore. He shows up on set one day completely drunk. He curses Goebbels and Hitler. He's summoned to Berlin, where Goebbels and the Gestapo have him killed. They hang the director. They have trouble, not surprisingly, no other directors came forward offering their services. They are on set, the Gestapo is on set, the SS, if an actor misses their cue, they shoot him in the head. Get me the understudy. Everything's going crazy. Finally, they finish this movie. Before they launch Hollywood on the Rhine, before Goebbels shows it to the Fuhrer, he sits down for a private screening. When he watches it, he's mortified. The movie is basically about a fanatical captain that's driving innocent people into an iceberg and to their death. It's a metaphor for Nazi Germany with Hitler as the captain. Herbert Selpin, the director, put all this stuff in the movie before he died. Goebbels has the movie banned. They burn almost every copy of the movie after all of that. Fortunately, some pirated copies made it out to Prague and to Paris. And you can watch the movie today on YouTube with English subtitles. Do you all remember before James Cameron made the great Titanic film with DiCaprio? There was, I think, a far better Titanic movie, with all due respect to Cameron. That was the British film of the 50s, A Night to Remember. I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember that, but okay, no one is. So, it's a fantastic film. Well, check this out. The British film, all the sinking scenes and ship scenes are the German film, the Nazi Titanic. If you want to see the Nazi Titanic, just watch the old British film. There was no copyright. All the Nazis were dead. So they used the ship in the sinking scenes. Okay, 100 other crazy things happened. Let's fast forward to the end of the war and get to the main reason for this book. In the winter of 1945, and again in the spring, March, April, Hitler issues his infamous liquidation decree. Destroy all evidence of the Holocaust, destroy all the papers, and kill all the prisoners. Some concentration camp commandants just start killing everyone, wholesale. Heinrich Himmler enters our story. Himmler issues a countermanding decree telling concentration camp commandants not to kill everyone. He says, don't let anyone fall into the hands of the Allies. What does he mean? He wants to save thousands, tens of thousands of Holocaust prisoners, but he can't say that because Hitler would have him killed. So by saying don't let him fall into the hands of the Allies, he kind of covers his trail. Here's his plan. Heinrich Himmler wants to save up to 100,000 survivors. He wants to trade them to Eisenhower and Montgomery in exchange for his life. He also wants to seek a separate conditional surrender on the Western Front, as if Truman would have accepted a conditional surrender. No one would have. That way the Nazis could reallocate their troops to the Eastern Front because it was the Red Army that they were really worried about. The Soviets in their march from the East were killing every man, woman, child, civilian, anyone they encountered. That's what they were worried about. So what Himmler's plan is to send thousands of concentration camp prisoners to a camp called Neuengamme, N-E-U-E-N, Neuengamme, G-A-M-M-E. It's in Hamburg, which is in north-central Germany, not too many miles from the Baltic. They would all gather there as a central receiving place. Then from there, they would march thousands of people to the Baltic, take folks in trains and by river in barges. And they would all meet at the Baltic. They would summon ships or a ship. They would load everyone up with Himmler, and they would sail to meet with Ike. Which ship do you think Heinrich Himmler picked? Of course, the Nazi Titanic. So the ship is so big, it can't dock. It comes into Lübeck Bay, north-central Germany, to a port called Neustadt, or Newtown. And it's so big it can't dock, it has to drop anchor 3 kilometers off the coast. So thousands and thousands of Holocaust survivors march north. Thousands more are taken by train and barges, and it's maybe the bloodiest death march in history. Tens of thousands possibly die. The Nazis took meticulous records, but they're running for their life now, so the records are not complete. Enter into this scene a Swedish diplomat named Count Folke Bernadotte, part of the royal family. He was the head of the Red Cross. He looks like a young Roger Moore, circa the James Bond years, a dashing fellow. Count Bernadotte realizes that when the war is ending, the Nazis will kill everyone. He hears a rumor that Heinrich Himmler wants to negotiate. So he goes and meets with Himmler and says, I will help you. I'll talk to Ike and Monty, I know them, and we'll negotiate for your life. He says, I know Ike and Monty, I know Churchill, I know FDR. He didn't. He was lying through his teeth. He said, but for me to do this, I need a gesture from you. I need you to release to me the Scandinavian prisoners from the Holocaust. Remember, a lot of the Norwegians and Danish policemen were fighting back. So Himmler is so desperate and delusional, he takes the deal. He releases a few thousand Scandinavians. Count Folke Bernadotte puts them in his white Red Cross buses, ambulances, and hustles them back to Sweden. He comes back and says, I met with Ike and Monty. They want to do the deal, which he never met with them. He plays him like a guitar. Himmler says, okay, and Count Folke Bernadotte says, but Ike wants the French and women, otherwise no deal. So Himmler authorizes women from Ravensbrück and French prisoners to go and meet with them. As he's doing this, Adolf Hitler hears that Himmler is doing a back-channel deal. Hitler sends 2 assassins to kill Himmler. Himmler changes his identity, his clothing. He takes on the fake identity of a German police officer and goes on the run. He would later get caught and kill himself, suicide capsule. So Himmler's out of the way. Hitler kills himself in the bunker. He tested his suicide on his favorite dog, his German Shepherd Blondie. It worked. Then he gets married to Eva Braun in the last minute, has her commit suicide. Joseph Goebbels comes into the bunker, brings his wife and 6 kids, puts his 6 kids in their pajamas with teddy bears, has all of them killed. He and his wife are killed. The Nazi command is wiped out. So you have thousands of people that are marching to the coast to get on this big ship, and no one knows what the heck to do about it. Count Folke Bernadotte rushes to meet with Himmler. Himmler's gone. He rushes to Neuengamme and says, I need women from Ravensbrück and the French. The commandant says, I'm not giving them to you. Bernadotte says, Himmler agreed. And the guy says, where's Himmler? Max Schmidt was his name. So Bernadotte has to rush back to Sweden and get treasure, art, and gold to bribe the Nazis. They could be bribed. They release women and French to him, but he has to go into the camps to see it. Now he sees a concentration camp. He comes out and loads a couple thousand women and French on his Red Cross buses and white ships, and he says, now I'm coming back for the Jews. He races back to Sweden, races back to Neuengamme to get the Jews, and they they march out of the camp the day before. He knows that they were at the camp because countless people were killed at the camp. Those that couldn't walk are just machine gunned. The camp was doing vicious medical experiments on little children, a la Dr. Mengele. And they killed all the children that were being subjected to these tuberculosis experiments. Count Folke Bernadotte knows where the prisoners went because he followed a path of dead bodies all the way north to the Baltic. They had to stop the trucks every couple of minutes and put the bodies out of the road. They followed them to the Baltic. He said that he smelled death before he arrived at the Baltic. What had happened was hundreds, if not thousands, of people were taken by train to the Baltic. When the Nazis stopped at the port, rather than transitioning the people from the train to the ship, they took off their uniforms and ran for their lives, not unlocking the doors with all the folks in the train. Left out in the May sun for days without food or water, everyone died. Bernadotte arrived to that death scene. They're taking people by the thousands out and boarding them on the ship. There's no water on the ship. There's no food on the ship. They take off all the life jackets. They punch holes in all the lifeboats. They fill the ship up with gasoline so it will burn better. By day, dozens, if not hundreds, are dying on board the ship by the day and just being thrown overboard, and then thousands more are brought out. Hundreds die, then 1,000 is brought out, then another 100 dies, then 500 is brought back out. This is what's happening at the Baltic. Count Folke Bernadotte arrives there and uses his treasure to bribe the guards. And he gets out to the ship. He rescues over 1,600 Jews. He puts them on his white ambulances and his white ships and races back to Sweden. Now we're into May of 45. It's a race against time. The war is going to end. He races them back to Sweden to get more money, treasury, loot to come back and bribe. As he's racing back, he arrives, as I said, after the initial march. He arrives back at the port the day after the ship is blown up to find thousands and thousands of dead folks. He spends days burying in mass unmarked cemeteries. Here's what happens. There are thousands of people aboard the ship and no one knows what to do with them. There is an officer, two officers at the coast. The top Nazi politician, his name was Karl Kaufmann with a K and a K. And the top Gestapo official was a guy named Count George von Basewitz-Behr, B-E-H-R, like the paint company. Von Basewitz-Behr and Karl Kaufmann meet, and they say, what do we do with these thousands of people on the ship? Kaufmann comes up with a plan. Let's just put everyone on the ship, and then we'll blow it up and scuttle the ship. But we'll wait until a surrender is signed. Then it'll be our last FU to the world. Now, so they just pack people on board the ship. After the war is over, they capture Count George von Basewitz-Behr, give him to the Russians who take him to Siberia, and that's the end of him. Karl Kaufmann goes to the post-war tribunals, not Nuremberg, but the Hamburg tribunals. He's found innocent and lives a long, comfortable life, dies in his bed at home. So they load thousands of people up at the ship. As they're ready to sink the ship, the British 6th Commando, the Special Forces unit, comes charging into the Baltic. The intelligence officer that called in to strike was a guy named Ian Fleming, if that name rings a bell, who would go on to write the James Bond books. The general in charge of the Special Forces that hit the port was that Mills Roberts, the guy I told you about at the beginning of this talk, whose letter I found. And they hit the port, and before the Nazis can sink the ship, they overrun the Nazis. Now, you don't have the Nazi regular military, the Wehrmacht. You have a couple of older men in what was called the Volkssturm with old guns. Most of these guys surrender right away. There are Hitler Youth and a naval training barracks. Most of the young cadets in Hitler Youth run away into the woods. The older folks in the Volkssturm surrender. So they're mopping it up, and as they're helping the people at the port and signing the surrender, people at the port are yelling to the British, "You got to get out to the ship." There are countless thousands and are dying by the hundreds by the day. So as the British prepare to go out to the ship, they hear a deafening roar. They look up into the sky, and 6 squadrons of British bombers fly into the Baltic, and they open up on the Nazi Titanic, blowing it out of the water. So much gasoline was put on the ship that the boat explodes up and then back down into the water. 3 kilometers away on the port, the blast is so powerful that it knocks people over. It creates a huge wave. People are blown up into the overboard into the sea. The Baltic is 42 degrees Fahrenheit in early May. Folks had not eaten for days. They survived the Holocaust. Most drowned immediately or die of hypothermia. The planes that hit it that day were called Typhoon bombers. They're not huge like the British Lancaster bombers or our B-24s or B-27s. They're sort of mid-sized planes that could fit in this room. They're sort of a hybrid plane. They had bombs, but they also had machine guns like a fighter. And a fighter pilot could fly it or a bomber pilot. After the Typhoons hit the Nazi Titanic, blowing it up in this fireball, they spin around, and anyone that made it in the water, they strafe them with their machine guns, killing who knows how many. Then they veer off and they hit the port, where there are thousands of people with striped pajamas at the port, and they go down the port strafing the people at the port. One of the pilots, and all the pilots after a mission record your battle report. Those were all classified. I reprinted some of them in the book. One of the pilots was talking about these 20 millimeter cannons that they shot from the wings. They had bullets the size of a tube of toothpaste. He said it was sawing, S-A-W, sawing people in half. Torsos would go one way up and down the port. Then they flew back. There were 2 barges that were being towed in, full of survivors, and they were these coal barges that were very deep, filled with hundreds and hundreds of survivors. The bombers strafe the tugboat, so the captain of the tugboat cuts the barges loose. One rolls over and top down goes straight down, taking who knows how many people to the bottom of the Baltic. The other one floats ashore and it washes up on the beach. There's not a ladder, so people inside are trying to get to the high rim of it. The Hitler Youth come running out of the woods, climb up onto the deck, and shoot everybody inside the container. General Mills Roberts describes this, and I reprint his letter. He said that these Nazis used the last breath on this earth not to run away, not to surrender, not to fight the British, but to kill more survivors. He said it was the only time in uniform I was neither an officer nor a gentleman. He said, I told my men, kill every damn one of them with your bare hands. There's no prisoners. And the British 6th Commando with the Scottish 15th proceed to kill the Hitler Youth. A few people made it off the ship miraculously. One was a guy named Francis Akos, A-K-O-S. He was Hungarian. He had once upon a time been the principal violinist for the Budapest Jewish Symphony. He survived multiple concentration camps, the death march, and days below deck on the ship. He's blown overboard. He speaks a little German, and there's a German ship going by picking up German sailors that were blown into the Baltic. They pick him up, they realize he's a concentration camp prisoner, they throw him back in the Baltic. He and a couple of men managed to swim 3 kilometers in the freezing cold water to the shore. As these several men hit the shore, they're so weak they're just lying on the beach. Akos is still out in the water. Some of the Hitler Youth and naval cadets run out, they're out of bullets, run out from the woods. They use the butt of their guns to bash the skulls in of those people lying on the beach too weak to get up. Akos swims back into the Baltic. He comes back later and goes ashore with a couple of other folks. He and these other men walk ashore, naked, freezing, starving. As they're walking to the town, they hear behind them in German, hands up. They turn around and there's a naval cadet ready to kill them. Right before he fires, he's shot and killed. The Scottish and British overrun the coast. He lives through this ordeal, lives through the Holocaust. He moves to Chicago and becomes the first chair principal violinist for the Great Chicago Symphony. Serves for decades in that capacity, retires around the age of 80 as the concert master of the Chicago Symphony. Francis Akos just passed away in December in his 90s. There were 2 brothers, Berek and Józek Jakubowicz. Polish as the name would suggest. They survived a number of camps, including Auschwitz. They were taken to Neuengamme and taken all the way north to the Baltic. They were put for days in one of the holds in the ship. Amazingly, as the ship is blown up and as it's overturning, the ship is so big that it's bigger than the Baltic is deep at 3 kilometers, so it never truly sinks. It's like a beached whale. It rolls over, it's halfway below the water, halfway sticking up like a whale. The Jakubowiczes are below deck, there's fire, and then it's filling up with water, everyone's dying. They thought they were done. Amazingly, some of the people that survived on the ship, rather than jumping overboard to save their lives, they went below decks and opened up the holds for their comrades. And there's the Jakubowicz brothers. There must have been 1,000 people below deck and a half a foot of urine and feces, they said. Most of them could not stand. The few that could stand, they lifted up, and the rescuers and the Jakubowicz brothers run down a hallway like in the movie The Poseidon Adventure. They get to a door, they open the door, and there's a wall of fire. They race back to another door, there's a wall of fire, they're trapped. The fire starts coming down the hallway, there's a vent above them. They open the vent and climb out of the vent, and as they reach down to help their rescuers, the wall of flames incinerates everybody in the hallway. They make it to the deck, but now the ship is rolling over. So what they do is they shimmy to the bottom of the ship, which is now the top of the ship, to stay above the waterline. The problem is that fire raging inside the ship was so horrific that the metal on deck is literally cooking and baking people to death. Berek tells his brother Józek, we need to get off the ship or we're going to be baked alive. Berek knows how to swim, Józek does not. So Berek decides to try his chances in the water, Józek decides to try his chances on the bottom of the ship. They give their brotherly goodbyes. Berek goes down the anchor line, he's ready to drown in the water. He went down with one friend who drowns, and all of a sudden a German fisherman pulls him out of the water. He won't tell Berek his name because he's afraid of the Nazis. He takes him ashore, takes him to a bakery, lights the oven, ironically enough, and Berek leans against the oven all night to keep warm. All night long, the door opens and survivors, naked, freezing, straggle in, and they wrap up in burlap sacks to keep warm. In the morning, the door of the bakery is kicked open. Barrick thought he was going to die, but it was the British, not the Nazis. The British rescued them and took him to a hospital. When he goes into the hospital, guess who Barrick finds? Josek. That night, the British went out to find survivors, and Josek was still on bottom of the ship, but the only way he could live is he piled up all the dead and sat on top of them so he wouldn't be baked to death. Barrick and Josek are reunited. They moved to Boston. They live long lives and become successful businessmen. Barrick's wife still lives north of Boston today. Moral of the story, as you heard in the introduction, we'd like to think that we know all there is to know about these events. There's more we don't know. This was the world's worst instance of friendly fire. This was the single bloodiest hour of the entire Holocaust. It was perhaps the most tragic maritime disaster in history. Many times more people die on this than died on the Titanic. It might have been the last tragedy of the Holocaust, and for 7 decades, it's largely remained a secret. I can't even imagine what secrets history's still holding on to and begrudgingly releasing from year to year for us to find out. And with that, I thank you for your time. Okay. Questions? Questions, and I'll repeat them nice and loud. I think we have a few minutes. Sir.
When some of the British discovered what had happened unintendedly, are there any of them that history has recorded what their reaction was this in terms of guilt or rage, anger? Yes. What was recorded?
Did you all hear that? When the British realized, was there guilt, was there rage, was there anger, was there an apology? What was recorded? We don't know exactly who it was that sealed all these documents away. I have a couple of objectives for this book. Usually when you finish a book, you never even open it up, you're done with it. This one I intend to live with for the next couple of years. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to find out the name of who sealed the documents, when, where, how, and why. We don't know. What we do know is General Mills Roberts, the commander at the port, he didn't seal it, and he was mortified. He was disgusted when he realized what happened. But all of his records were locked away. Till, the British major, who I opened up with his letter, he was sent to study this. He didn't recommend it be sealed. He wrote this horrific narrative of what happened, but his documents were sealed. The head of the Royal Archives in London and the head of the Imperial War Museum and their archival staff there could not have been more helpful. Their view was that they believe it was an unfortunate snafu. It was one of those things in history. At the end of the war, as millions of documents come in, nobody wanted to remember the war. We all had war fatigue. We all had to pivot to the Pacific theater, island hopping and dropping the bomb. We had millions of refugees in Europe, the Pacific, Asia. The world was facing a pandemic of global hunger, had it not been for Truman. Port trains have blown up, airports are blown up. And it was just locked away and they forgot about it. One of my goals is to ask the British government to issue an official acknowledgement, not an apology, because it's a war, but I do believe in acknowledgement. Not that anything can provide closure for families that lost people to this and close such an unimaginable, tragic chapter in our history, but I would like to see some acknowledgement. There was a young cabin boy by the name of Wolf on board the ship, and he takes the ship's little launch, and he spends the day while everybody's getting bombed and strafed, sailing around rescuing people out of the water. Now that we know his story, I would like to approach Yad Vashem to see if they would classify him as among the righteous for risking his life to save countless people. And we don't even know what happened to the kid. I don't know if he died after that or if he grew old. So I'm hopeful that a lot of these stories will come out. There's one small, hidden, insignificant monument that just lists some of the countries where there were prisoners from, and the date. We don't even know their names. It sits in a quiet little fishing village on the German coast, obscured, and no one knows about it. I would like to try to raise awareness to get a proper monument for this. So there's a lot of projects I have based on this. I've already started releasing documents, photographs, as widely as possible. You can go on Google Images and catch a lot of the pictures that I posted. I also put a bunch of photos in the book. No copyright. So we're releasing as much as we can for the public. Ma'am, and I'll come over.
That you read Goebbels' diary.
I reread Joseph Goebbels' diaries
Is that
in
published?
entirety.
Is it published?
Yes, Goebbels' diaries have been translated into English and edited, and done a very good job with it. It's a remarkably difficult read. This guy hated humanity. He was just consumed with venom. He was raw evil. He just curses everyone. He calls people names: pig, ugly, fat. There's a punchline there, but I'll resist it. But he just calls people names. He's literally, everybody that disagrees with him, he just calls them names. He's just consumed with hate. Goebbels thought that the 1935 Nuremberg laws, which disenfranchised Jews as not having full citizenship, you can't enter public service, you can't be in the law, can't be in academia, you can't marry someone who's Aryan and Jew. He thought the 1935 Nuremberg laws, as venomous as they were, he thought they were too soft. So when it jumps out of the pages, he's a monster. My purpose for reading them was to track the movie connection and his connection to the Nazi Titanic. The same reason I read Himmler and some of Hitler's secretaries, to track this connection to this, and they were all connected by this ship. Sir?
You mentioned the pilots that came into the Baltic.
Yep.
And they were doing their bombing and strafing, which in a time of war would be probably a logical thing to do. They're
Yes.
probably flying a German flag. The debriefing that they would have gone through, I'm curious as to what
Good.
their positions were, because they obviously didn't know what was happening to begin with.
Good.
But on the other side, oh my God, what have I done?
So you have these pilots that hit the ship. They were debriefed afterwards. They wrote the reports. All this was classified and locked away. Now they're available. I reprint some of them in the book. What were these pilots thinking? One of the pilots was a Frenchman named Pierre Closterman. He was part of the Free French Forces, flying with the British Royal Air Force that day. Closterman offers some insights. He says that shortly before this attack at Lübeck Bay, just up the German coast is the important port of Kiel. He said, we flew into Kiel, and he said, my friend that was flying on my left wing and my friend flying on my right wing were both blown out of the sky by German anti-aircraft. He said they were putting up a fight to the bitter end. Klosterman said, the plane I flew, the Typhoon bomber, I flew that day in May when I went in and hit the Nazi Titanic. He said it had a hole in the tail big enough to kick a football, we would say soccer, ball through the hole. He said, when I came out of the clouds, I did not give a damn what I saw. He said, I was going to kill everything in the Baltic. I let go of every 500-pound bomb, every rocket. I shot every bullet I had at everything that I could see. I didn't care at that point. Here's the situation. Number one, Britain was running short of pilots. They grabbed most of the pilots that struck that day were 19, 20 years old. They gave them a couple of days of training and put them in a cockpit. These young men probably had pissed themselves with fear. Who wouldn't? No one wants to be the last fatality in the war. They went in guns a-blazing. Number two, by horrible luck, it was overcast that day. They were supposed to hit the ships that morning. It was so overcast they couldn't see. They flew back and refueled. They came in at 2:30 p.m. It was still cloudy enough and foggy enough they had to drop down to 2,000 feet. No bomber wants to be below 2,000 feet. You're a sitting duck. They came in fast, hard, quick with everything they had and got out. Number three, Bomber Command is put in charge of such missions. Bomber Command has good intelligence. You have to. You're bombing from 10,000 feet or whatever. Count Folke Bernadotte, the Swedish Red Cross official, the day before the bombing, he rescued 1,600 Jews. He notified Bomber Command that the Nazi Titanic is full of Holocaust prisoners. However, the day of the attack, Bomber Command was so understaffed, they assigned the mission to Fighter Command without intel. No one passed the memo. Fighter Command came in. Remember I said the Typhoons could be flown either by a fighter or a bomber? Typhoon Command was under, the Typhoons were under Fighter Command. These young guys just came in not knowing. Lastly, there was a rumor, which is somewhat substantiated, that the Nazis were going to try to flee through the Baltic to Norway, to use the geographic isolation, the mountains, the cold weather, and the deep fjords to dig in for one last redoubt, a final stand. The British and American airplanes had seen Nazi subs, U-boats, going into Norway. And in fact, when Norway was liberated at the very end of the war, they found over 100 U-boats hiding in their fjords. So one of the theories was that the Nazis would go and board these massive ocean liners, the biggest ship, and sail to Norway with soldiers. So they didn't know if it was true or not, but the pilots came in and they said, why risk the world's bloodiest war, which raged for years, when we can end it now? So even though you and I would know the difference between an ocean liner and a battleship, you and I would know the difference between a uniformed Kriegsmarine sailor and a concentration camp prisoner skeletal with a striped uniform. These guys came in fast, hard. So I don't know that you can ask for an apology or condemn them. What you can do is ask for an acknowledgement. Ma'am, did you have your hand up? I thought I saw one over here. Sir?
You said that you got this started with that letter from the prelate.
I found a letter from a major, a British officer who was sent in to look at this after the war, and all of his stuff was sealed and classified, but he wrote to someone saying what he found, and I found a letter that he wrote to a friend.
So all the other information about the individuals you were talking about and all of that portion came from the documents?
Where'd all this stuff come from? The documents were to be sealed until the year 2045. Britain has this national secrets rule that after 30 years they declassify things, if they know what they have. Much of these documents sat in the basement somewhere in London and no one knew what they had, and no one asked that they be released. So a lot of stuff had been locked away sitting there for years. By dumb luck, I found the letter. By dumb luck, I met Deborah Oppenheimer while giving a lecture at D-Day. By dumb luck, her parents go to my lectures in South Florida. And by dumb luck, she's a part of the Downton Abbey team, and she called, and it's one phone call from her, they released everything and sent it all to me. I suspect there might still be things in the basement there that we don't know about. I don't know, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all. But again, I'm excessively reasonable and rational. But you know, except Obama's from Planet Zebulon, right, or something like that. That's how we got a hold of the documents, and we're able to tell the story. I met with maybe 200, 250, 2-3 weeks ago in New York City, Holocaust Museum directors, rabbis, and JCC, Jewish Community Center directors, to tell them the story, to make available documents. I've been just sending stuff out, whatever I have, so that hopefully the story gets out there and we can begin to put it in textbooks, put it in Holocaust museums. We can begin to have rabbis and preachers, everybody talk about it from the pulpit. Ma'am?
I would like to know, since it's this horrific story that you've told us, how do you deal with the things, reading these people's diaries?
Good.
I mean, this has to be horrible for you.
It is. Did you all hear that? How do I deal with reading all this? You know, one of the jobs of an historian or an archivist, it's boring. It can be really exciting, but you spend hours. For example, people say military history is fascinating. Military history from the dawn of mankind up until World War II was weeks and weeks and months of just dulldom, boredom, drudgery, followed by a half an hour of sheer terror. This, as I said at the outset, was the most difficult book I've ever done. I do a lot of my writing at night. I have a patient wife and kids, and I'll say after they go to bed, I gotta go into the office. And usually I'm all excited. I'll say I found some Revolutionary War diary that no one knows about. And we thought, I know it sounds boring, but one of my books is on the War of 1812. And there are a couple of battles we thought we won, I found out we lost. And that was exciting, if you like that kind of thing. So I would say I'm all excited because I have this British pilot, Pierre Klosterman's report. I can't wait to read it. And then they interviewed some of the folks in the town. There's audio tape. I'm going to go in and listen to this audio tape that's been locked away for 7 decades. It's like, you know, an archaeologist opening up the Pharaoh's tomb or something. And I would come back in an hour, and my wife would say, why are you back so soon? And I would say, I can't read anymore. It's too depressing. It's too difficult. I mean, I would just listen to it, and I go, it can't get any worse. And then the next day, I'd find something else. So it was very difficult. It was a tough story to write, tough story to tell. But really, if the words never forget or never again are going to have meaning, we've got to tell every one of these stories, not only for those who are past, but for the next generation to be sure to tell it. So it was a tough job, but I felt honored to have tripped across the documents. Sir?
Now, when I think of Nazi propaganda films, I think of Leni Riefenstahl.
Yep.
And Triumph of the Will.
Yep.
And she did some really good work and really dreadful.
Yes.
And-
Her work was both brilliant and horrifying at the same time. Yeah.
Now, was she still
Okay,
working for the
good.
Nazis? and-
Leni Riefenstahl's classic Triumph of the Will about the massive Nazi party rallies. There's a whole chapter in the book about that. She influenced the film and the ship as well. Riefenstahl was a trailblazer in her cinematography. She was the first one to put like a little train track with a camera on a little train thing and roll it down to get those crowd scenes. She had camera crewmen dressed like soldiers and march along with cameras so you felt like you were in this marching army, which gave people that sense of excitement. Hitler was not a real tall guy, so what she did when he was at up at the stage, she dug trenches and shot from the trench to make him look even taller. And if you saw, everybody saw Star Wars. Lucas's opening scene is pretty much from Triumph of the Will. It opens with those big block letters a long time ago in a country, Germany. A Führer was born, and as a Messiah, he's given to the people. So that, and then you remember in Star Wars, you see the spaceship thing come over? Well, after the big block letters, you see an airplane come over, it lands, and Hitler comes out a la the Messiah. So Joseph Goebbels could not stand Leni Riefenstahl because Hitler admired her. Goebbels had almost this strange guy crush on Hitler, and he was jealous of Hitler's attention. So Goebbels knew that this movie would make him the greatest movie producer, even more than Leni Riefenstahl. But Hitler assigned Goebbels and Herbert Salpin to use Riefenstahl's cinematography approach in making this movie. So when you watch the film, it's like Triumph of the Will. It's brutally difficult to watch because you know about it. But from a cinematography perspective, it's absolutely brilliant. Let me get one or two more because we're about out of time. Sir?
You mentioned a number of the survivors from the ship. Did you have a chance to interview anybody?
Yeah, the survivors. I had a chance to talk to a few survivors, a few wives of survivors, a few kids and grandkids of survivors. And what we found was here, lo and behold, the U.S. Holocaust Museum in D.C., their staff is amazing. The Shoah Foundation, their staff is amazing. Now, they've taped thousands of interviews, but just because they tape them doesn't mean they're all digitized. There are still some that are in the basement somewhere, right? So I found that a couple of these people had said that they taped them. The staffs were kind enough to send someone down to find the tapes and digitize them and release them. So I watched tapes, I read their deposition, if you will, interviewed family members to try to piece this together. Give you one sort of sad story. More than one of the family members said, yeah, my pa or my grandfather would be asked occasionally to go to the JCC or Hillel and share his Holocaust stories. And he would tell everybody I was on this Titanic and it was blown up and then the war was over. And people would kind of go, thank you, he's starting to lose it, right? Because if somebody sat down and said, I was on the Titanic and it was blown up at the end of the war, I would go, okay, thank you for your time. And students, let's all clap now, right? So I wonder how many folks were telling these stories and everybody kind of went, yeah, there was a Titanic, right? So, those family members are now fine. Let me take one last one, ma'am.
Have you written about the Holocaust before, or was this your first experience?
This is my first book on the Holocaust. I have written about our friend Harry Truman's relationship with Zionist leaders and his work with the establishment of Israel. And I've written about the displaced persons and refugees at the end of the war. But this is my first book on the Holocaust. I'll end with this. The book was supposed to be released in December. It wasn't released until the end of April, 24th, 26th. And I had some concerns, and my publisher had some concerns. My literary agent and publicist had some concerns. One of the concerns was, no one's going to believe this. They're going to think it's a novel or that I made it all up. I mean, I've written a lot of history books, but I'm not David McCullough by any stretch. So no one's going to believe, So we didn't know what to do about that. The second thing was because it was my first book on the Holocaust, I wanted to make sure, and it's such a, I think an important tragic story, I wanted to make sure all my T's were crossed and my I's were dotted. So we killed two birds with one stone. At the recommendation of my publisher and literary agent, they said, let's get the biggest names in the field and some famous people, like Alan Dershowitz went through all the documents for me. And then he wrote that it's all adds up. And Dershowitz is, the best jurist and attorney in the country. We got Michael Berenbaum, who's probably the world's leading Holocaust scholar, who was here a year ago for you guys. And, you know, he knows everything about it. To go through and make sure it added up. Rabbi David Gordis, if you know him, one of the world's most famous rabbis. We got, you know, Academy Award winners. We got, you know, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, folks to go through it. And then they were able to say it's real, but then they were able to satisfy my concerns that I didn't make some glaring error in the book. Again, to close, I just want to thank our hosts, the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, the Truman Library, the National Archives, UMKC's, the Truman Center. Thanks for the chance to come back to KC and pick up some barbecue sauce for the kids. I'll hang out outside and sign books or answer questions if you like. Thank you.